Picture this, you're standing in one of the busiest airports in Canada. Thousands of people flow around you like a river. Security cameras track nearly every step. Access logs record every door opened, every badge swiped. You're surrounded by technology, by witnesses, by the infrastructure of modern surveillance. Now imagine vanishing. Not in some remote forest or dark alley, but right here, in this hyper-monitored space where anonymity should be impossible. Imagine disappearing so completely that, for 17 years, nobody can explain where you went or what happened in those crucial missing minutes. On November 15, 2007, that's exactly what happened to Natalie Elise Morrell at Toronto Pearson International Airport. She was 28 years old, a successful marketing professional, walking through a busy concourse toward her gate. Security cameras captured her confident stride, her rolling carry-on luggage, her quick glance at her phone. And then she was gone. Not gradually, not through any door that made sense. She simply ceased to exist on camera, as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole in the middle of one of the world's most surveilled environments. For 17 years, this case haunted Toronto police. It frustrated airport security officials. It tormented a family who searched desperately for answers that seemed to evaporate like morning fog. Detectives reviewed thousands of hours of grainy footage. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They chased leads across 2 continents. Every single trail went cold. The case file grew thicker, but the mystery only deepened. How does someone vanish from an international airport without a trace? Where did Natalie Morrell go in those 18 critical minutes between the last camera sighting and the moment she was supposed to board her flight? The answer, when it finally came in 2024, would shock the entire community and expose a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, protected by nothing more than a blind spot in the surveillance system and the cruel passage of time. This is the story of how a cold case from 2007 became one of Canada's most significant solved cases, how modern technology finally illuminated those dark 18 minutes, and how an arrest in 2024 brought both justice and heartbreak to a family that never stopped searching. This is the story of Natalie Elise Morrell. Let me introduce you to Natalie. Natalie Elise Morrell was 28 years old in November of 2007. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company based in downtown Toronto, a position she'd earned through hard work, natural charisma, and an almost obsessive attention to detail that her colleagues both admired and sometimes teased her about. Friends described Natalie as someone who planned everything. She kept color-coded calendars, set multiple alarms, and always arrived 15 minutes early to meetings. Her apartment in the Annex neighborhood was organized with the precision of a museum exhibit. She meal prepped on Sundays, laid out her work clothes the night before, and maintained a fitness routine that rarely varied. But this wasn't rigidity born of anxiety. Those who knew Natalie well understood that her meticulous planning gave her freedom. Because she organized the mundane details of life so efficiently, she had energy and spontaneity for the things that mattered. Impromptu dinners with friends, weekend road trips, volunteer work at a local literacy center where she tutored adults learning to read. Her sister, Jennifer, would later tell investigators that Natalie was the person you called when you needed something done right. She was the one who organized family gatherings, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who somehow always knew exactly what to say when someone was struggling. Natalie's parents, Robert and Susan Morrell, described their daughter as deeply loyal. She called them every single day without fail, sometimes just for 2 minutes to say hello, sometimes for an hour-long conversation about work challenges or family news. But always, every day, that connection remained unbroken. She'd been in a relationship with a fellow marketing professional named David Chun for about 3 years, though by late 2007, friends noted that the relationship seemed to be fraying. They'd broken up and reconciled twice that year. The final split had come just 6 weeks before Natalie's disappearance, and while both maintained it was amicable, Jennifer remembered her sister seeming relieved, as if a weight had lifted. Natalie was also a frequent business traveler. Her job required regular trips to conferences, client meetings, and the company's satellite offices in Montreal, Vancouver, and occasionally Boston or New York. She'd made the journey through Toronto Pearson Airport dozens of times. She knew the terminals, the security procedures, the best coffee shops to grab something during a layover. She was comfortable there, confident. This was routine territory. Her colleagues at the pharmaceutical company remembered Natalie as someone who lit up presentations with her energy. She had a gift for making complex medical marketing concepts accessible and engaging. She'd recently been promoted, and there was talk of her leading a major new product launch in the spring of 2008. Outside of work, Natalie loved photography. She carried a small digital camera everywhere, capturing what she called the overlooked moments. Raindrops on car windows, elderly couples holding hands, graffiti that made her think. She'd been talking about turning this hobby into something more, maybe a weekend workshop or an online portfolio. She ran half marathons, though she insisted she wasn't naturally athletic and had to work hard for every kilometer. She volunteered at animal shelters on weekends when she wasn't traveling. She had a sharp sense of humor that could catch you off guard, delivering perfectly timed observations that made entire rooms laugh. She was, in every way, a person deeply embedded in life. She had plans, connections, responsibilities, dreams. She had a family that adored her and friends who depended on her. She had a career on the rise and a future that seemed bright with possibility. She was not someone who would simply walk away from everything. And yet, on that November evening in 2007, Natalie Elise Morrell would do exactly that, or appear to. She would leave behind her luggage, her passport, her carefully planned life, and vanish into a surveillance blind spot that would become one of Toronto's most baffling mysteries. November 15, 2007. A Thursday evening, already dark by 5:30 as Toronto settled into the gray grip of late autumn. Natalie had a straightforward plan that day. She'd worked a full day at her downtown office, finalizing materials for a client presentation scheduled for the following morning in Montreal. The flight was a short hop, barely an hour in the air, departing Toronto Pearson at 7:45 p.m., landing at Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau just after 9. She'd booked a hotel near the Montreal office. Her return flight was scheduled for Friday evening. It was the kind of quick overnight business trip she'd made countless times before. According to her assistant, Natalie left the office around 4 p.m., giving herself plenty of time to get home, grab her pre-packed overnight bag, and make the drive to the airport. Traffic was moderate. Weather was cold but clear. Nothing unusual. At 5:47 p.m., Natalie sent a text message to her mother. At airport, heading to gate. Talk tomorrow morning. Love you. Susan Morrell would later tell police that this was completely normal. Natalie always sent a quick message when she reached the airport, a small ritual that gave her parents peace of mind. At 5:52 p.m., airport parking records show Natalie's car, a silver Honda Civic, entering the short-term parking structure. Ticket stub data would later confirm she'd pulled a parking ticket at the automated gate. Here's where the CCTV trail begins. At 6:03 p.m., cameras capture Natalie entering Terminal 1 through the main doors. She's wearing dark jeans, ankle boots, a burgundy peacoat, and carrying a black rolling suitcase and a leather laptop bag over her shoulder. Her hair is pulled back in a ponytail. She's moving with purpose but not rushing. Everything about her body language suggests routine, normalcy, a person who's done this many times before. At 6:11 p.m., she's seen at the airline check-in kiosk, printing her boarding pass. No checked luggage. She's traveling with just her carry-on and laptop bag. At 6:17 p.m., cameras show her in the security line. There's a small delay. The line is moving slowly, typical for a Thursday evening. She's checking her phone, occasionally glancing up at the line's progress. At 6:32 p.m., she clears security without incident. The screening process was routine. Nothing was flagged. No unusual interactions with security personnel. And here's where Natalie Morrell enters the part of the airport where her fate would be sealed. At 6:39 p.m., CCTV captures Natalie walking through the main concourse of Terminal 1's secure area, past shops and restaurants, moving in the direction of her departure gate, which was Gate B27, about a 7-minute walk from where she stood. The concourse was busy but not packed. Thursday evening travelers heading to various Canadian and American destinations. business people like Natalie, families, students, the usual airport ecosystem. At 6:43 p.m., a camera positioned near a Tim Hortons coffee shop captures what would become the most analyzed piece of footage in the entire investigation. Natalie is walking at a steady pace, her rolling suitcase trailing behind her. She glances briefly to her left, as if checking a departure board or perhaps noticing something in one of the shops. And then she continues forward, moving out of that camera's frame. She never appeared on another camera. Not at gate B27. Not at any of the restaurants between the Tim Hortons and her gate. Not in any of the restrooms. Not at any other gate in Terminal 1. Security cameras covered most of the concourse, but not every angle. There were gaps, narrow corridors leading to service areas, older sections of the terminal where camera coverage was less dense, blind spots created by architectural features or simply by the limitations of a security system designed in the 1990s and only partially upgraded. Natalie Morrell walked into one of those gaps at approximately 6:44 p.m. And she never walked out. Pause. At 7:30 p.m., airline staff began the boarding process for Natalie's flight to Montreal. Her seat, 14A, a window seat she'd specifically requested, remained empty. This wasn't immediately concerning. Passengers sometimes miss boarding calls, get delayed at shops, lose track of time. At 7:40 p.m., a final boarding announcement went out. Natalie's name was called over the public address system. No response. At 7:45 p.m., the flight departed without her. Standard procedure dictated that her checked luggage would be removed from the plane, but Natalie had no checked bags. Her carry-on suitcase and laptop bag, wherever they were, weren't on that aircraft. It would be another 2 hours before anyone realized something was truly wrong. At 9:47 p.m., Susan Morrell called her daughter's cell phone. The call went straight to voicemail. This was unusual. Natalie always texted when she landed, but Susan initially assumed the phone had died. Natalie was notorious for forgetting to charge her devices. Susan sent a text. "Did you land safely? Call when you get this." No response. At 10:30 p.m., Susan tried again. Still voicemail. By 11 p.m., Susan was worried enough to call the hotel in Montreal, where Natalie had a reservation. The front desk confirmed that Ms. Morrell had not checked in and had not called to modify her reservation. Now Susan's concern shifted to alarm. She called the airline. After being transferred multiple times, she finally reached someone who could confirm that Natalie Morrell had checked in for the flight, had printed a boarding pass, but had never boarded the aircraft. The airline had no record of her canceling or requesting a refund. At 11:43 p.m., Susan Morrell called Toronto police. At 12:17 a.m. on November 16, 2007, officers arrived at Toronto Pearson International Airport to begin what would become one of the most frustrating missing person investigations in the city's history. When Toronto police first responded to the report of a missing airline passenger, the initial assumption was that this would resolve quickly. Adults miss flights for all sorts of reasons. Most of them are mundane. A sudden illness, a last-minute change of plans, a personal crisis that requires privacy. But Natalie Morrell didn't fit the profile of someone who'd simply changed her mind and forgotten to tell anyone. Detective Sergeant Marcus Shaw took the lead on the case. He was a 20-year veteran of Toronto police, experienced in missing persons investigations, and his instincts told him immediately that something was off. The airline confirmed Natalie had checked in. Airport security confirmed she'd cleared the checkpoint without incident. Her car was still in the parking structure, exactly where the parking records indicated she'd left it. Inside the vehicle, officers found nothing unusual: registration documents, an ice scraper, a few CDs, some loose change. No signs of struggle, no disturbing notes, nothing missing. But Natalie herself had vanished somewhere between clearing security and reaching her gate. Detective Shaw's team began with the obvious steps. They contacted Natalie's family, friends, colleagues, and her ex-boyfriend, David Chun. Everyone painted the same picture. Natalie was reliable, stable, not impulsive. Nobody knew of any reason she'd suddenly abandon her plans. David Chun, understandably, came under immediate scrutiny. Romantic partners always do in missing person cases, especially recent ex-partners. But Chen's alibi was ironclad. At the time Natalie disappeared, he was at a marketing conference in Vancouver, surrounded by dozens of witnesses. Phone records confirmed his location. There was no evidence he'd hired anyone or had any involvement in her disappearance. Natalie's financial records showed no unusual activity, no large cash withdrawals, no purchases suggesting she was planning to flee. Her credit cards hadn't been used after she entered the airport. Her phone had last pinged a cell tower near Terminal 1 at 6:41 p.m., then went dark. Either it was turned off, the battery died, or it was destroyed. The CCTV review became the heart of the investigation, and it was exhausting, meticulous work. Airport security provided access to all available footage from November 15th. Detective Shaw's team sat in darkened rooms, watching hour after hour of grainy, time-stamped video. They tracked Natalie's movements from the moment she entered the terminal until that final sighting at 6:43 p.m. near the Tim Hortons. And then they tried to figure out where she'd gone. The problem was the gap, the blind spot, between the Tim Hortons camera and the next cluster of cameras covering Gate B27 and the surrounding area. There was a stretch of corridor approximately 70 meters long where coverage was incomplete. Cameras covered the main walkway, but there were side corridors, service hallways, access doors to mechanical spaces, routes to older sections of the terminal that weren't fully monitored. Investigators identified 4 possible routes Natalie could have taken that would explain why she never appeared on the cameras near her gate. Route 1. She turned down a service corridor marked, "Authorized personnel only." Route 2. She entered a women's restroom in an older section of the terminal where camera coverage was sparse. Route 3. She was approached by someone and diverted to a different area of the airport. Route 4. She experienced a medical emergency and collapsed in one of the blind spots. Police searched every inch of those areas. They checked every restroom, every storage closet, every mechanical room. They used cadaver dogs to sweep sections of the terminal, parking structures, and nearby grounds. They searched vehicles in the parking garage. They drained retention ponds on airport property. Nothing. They interviewed airport staff who'd been working that evening. Hundreds of employees, gate agents, cleaning crews, food service workers, security personnel, maintenance staff, rental car employees, taxi drivers. They collected statements, checked schedules, looked for anyone who'd seen anything unusual or remembered a woman matching Natalie's description. The interviews produced dozens of possible sightings, but none that could be confirmed. In a busy airport, people see hundreds of faces. Memories blur. Timestamps get fuzzy. Several staff members thought they might have seen someone who looked like Natalie, but couldn't be certain, couldn't remember exactly when or where. One security guard reported seeing a woman near a restricted service door around 6:45 p.m., but he couldn't definitively identify her from the photo of Natalie. The timestamp was right, but the description was vague. Brunette, dark coat, pulling luggage. That could have been 100 different travelers that evening. Investigators also explored the possibility that Natalie had left the secure area. Could she have somehow exited back through security? Could she have found an unsecured exit? Airport security protocols made this unlikely but not impossible. The secure area was designed to prevent unauthorized entry, not necessarily to prevent exit. But all the legitimate exits, through security checkpoints, through gates leading to aircraft, were monitored. Natalie didn't appear on any of that footage leaving the secure zone. There were emergency exits, but they were alarmed. Opening one would have triggered an immediate security response. No alarms had been triggered that evening. Detective Shaw developed a timeline that accounted for every minute of Natalie's time in the airport except for 18 minutes. From 6:43 p.m. when she was last seen on camera to 7:01 p.m. when boarding began for her flight and she wasn't there. 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, Natalie Elise Morrell ceased to exist as a traceable person. She left no digital footprint, no physical evidence, no witnesses who could reliably say what happened. The investigation expanded outward. Police checked hotels, shelters, hospitals. They issued media appeals asking anyone with information to come forward. Natalie's photo was distributed across news outlets, transit stations, online platforms. Tips poured in. Someone thought they saw her at a bus station in Sudbury. Another caller reported a woman resembling Natalie at a coffee shop in Ottawa. Each lead was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Detectives considered every scenario: voluntary disappearance, abduction, foul play by an unknown perpetrator, an accident, even human trafficking. None of the theories fit perfectly. All of them had holes. By early 2008, 6 months after Natalie vanished, the investigation was stalling. Every promising lead had evaporated. The case file was thick with statements, reports, and analyzed footage, but the central mystery remained unsolved. Where did Natalie Morrell go in those 18 minutes? Who, if anyone, did she encounter? What happened to her luggage, her laptop, her phone, the physical items she was carrying? And most haunting of all, was she still alive? Detective Shaw didn't believe she was, though he couldn't prove it. The complete absence of evidence suggested something dark. People who voluntarily disappear usually leave some trace. A deliberate attempt to hide their tracks. People who have accidents are eventually found. The absolute void of information pointed to something else, something calculated. But without a body, without a suspect, without a clear scenario of what happened, the case was gridlocked. In December of 2008, 13 months after Natalie's disappearance, the active investigation was formally scaled back. Detective Shaw was reassigned to other cases. The file was transferred to Toronto Police's Cold Case Unit, where it would sit for the next 15 years, one folder among hundreds of unsolved missing person cases. Natalie Morrell became a statistic, a name in a database, a photograph on a missing person poster that yellowed and faded in police station hallways. But to her family, she remained everything. The years that followed Natalie's disappearance were a kind of living purgatory for the Morrell family. Not knowing is its own special torture. Hope and despair exist simultaneously, battling for space in every quiet moment. Susan and Robert Morrell became experts in a subject no parent ever wants to study: how to search for a missing adult child in a world that often seems designed to make people disappear. They hired private investigators, 3 different ones over the years, each bringing fresh eyes and new approaches. One specialized in digital forensics, searching online for any trace of Natalie's digital presence activating. Another focused on tracking potential sightings, following up on tips that police no longer had resources to chase. The third analyzed the airport disappearance from a security vulnerability perspective, trying to identify scenarios the original investigation might have missed. The private investigators were thorough and compassionate, but ultimately, they ran into the same walls police had hit. The trail was cold. The evidence was sparse. The surveillance gap was impenetrable. Jennifer, Natalie's sister, became the public face of the search. She created social media campaigns, organized annual awareness events on the anniversary of Natalie's disappearance, appeared on true crime podcasts, and maintained a website documenting every detail of the case. The website became a central hub for information. Jennifer posted timelines, maps of Toronto Pearson Airport highlighting the area where Natalie vanished, breakdowns of the investigation's findings, and appeals for information. She fielded tips from strangers who'd seen the case featured on television or mentioned in online forums. Some tips seemed promising. In 2010, someone reported seeing a woman who looked exactly like Natalie working at a gift shop in a small town in northern Ontario. Jennifer and her father drove 6 hours to investigate. The woman was approximately the right age and had similar features, but it wasn't Natalie. In 2012, a caller claimed to have information about a burial site near Barrie, about an hour north of Toronto. Police investigated. They found nothing connected to Natalie. In 2015, facial recognition technology flagged a woman in a YouTube video about sustainable farming in British Columbia. The family contacted the video creator. The woman agreed to meet with Jennifer via video call. She was sympathetic, patient, and definitively not Natalie. Each false lead was a small death. Each promising tip that led nowhere carved out a little more hope from the reservoir of optimism Susan and Robert tried desperately to maintain. They kept Natalie's room exactly as she'd left it. This is something families of the missing often do, preserve the space as a kind of temporal anchor, a physical manifestation of belief that the person will return. Natalie's marketing textbooks sat on her shelf. Her photographs still hung on the walls. Her closet held clothes she'd never wear again, though no one could bring themselves to say that aloud. Susan continued the ritual of calling Natalie's phone number, even though it had long been disconnected. The service provider had eventually terminated the account, but Susan would dial the number anyway, listening to the automated message that this number was no longer in service, because even that mechanical voice was a connection to her daughter. Robert threw himself into research. He became self-taught in airport security systems, surveillance technology, and missing person case studies. He attended conferences on missing and exploited persons. He networked with other families facing similar nightmares, building a community of shared grief and determination. The emotional toll on the family was incalculable. Marriages often don't survive the disappearance of a child, even an adult child. The statistics are grim, but Susan and Robert held on to each other with a fierce determination, understanding that falling apart served no one, least of all Natalie. Jennifer struggled with survivor's guilt, the irrational but powerful feeling that she should have somehow prevented what happened. She talked to Natalie the morning of November 15th, a brief phone call where they'd laughed about something trivial, made tentative plans to go shopping when Natalie returned from Montreal. The ordinariness of that conversation haunted her. If she'd known it would be the last time she'd hear her sister's voice, what would she have said differently? She went to therapy. She joined support groups for families of missing persons. She learned to function with the grief, to carry it like a weight that never gets lighter but eventually becomes familiar enough that you learn how to walk with it. The case would occasionally resurface in media coverage. True crime television shows featured Natalie's disappearance. Vanished Without a Trace, The Toronto Airport Mystery, was the title of one episode that aired on a popular cable network in 2013. The show brought renewed attention, generated a fresh wave of tips, but ultimately produced no breakthrough. Podcasters dissected the case, theorizing about what might have happened. Some believed Natalie had voluntarily disappeared, starting a new life under a different identity. Others suspected foul play by a stranger, a random predator who'd been in the right place at the right time. A few conspiracy theorists suggested elaborate scenarios involving organized crime or government cover-ups. The Morrell family listened to these theories with a mix of gratitude and frustration. They appreciated that people cared, that Natalie's story hadn't been forgotten, but the wild speculation sometimes felt disrespectful, turning their real anguish into entertainment. As the years passed, 5, then 10, then 15, the likelihood of finding Natalie alive diminished to a painful near zero. The family understood this intellectually, though emotionally they couldn't fully accept it. They shifted from hoping for her return to hoping for answers. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to bring her home, even if that meant bringing home remains for a proper burial. They needed closure, that often misunderstood concept. Closure doesn't mean forgetting or moving on. It means having enough information to transform the open wound of uncertainty into a scar that, while permanent, can at least begin to heal. Detective Shaw, though no longer actively working the case, never forgot about Natalie Morrell. He'd check in with the family annually, usually around the anniversary of her disappearance. He'd review the file periodically, hoping fresh eyes, even his own eyes years later, might catch something he'd missed the first time. In conversations with Susan and Robert, he'd often say the same thing: "I believe technology will eventually catch up to this case. The cameras from 2007 were primitive. The databases weren't connected the way they are now. Give it time. Something will break." Detective Shaw didn't know how right he was. In 2023, Toronto police reorganized their cold case unit, creating specialized teams focused on applying modern investigative technology to older unsolved cases. One team focused specifically on missing persons cases from the 2000s, an era when digital surveillance existed but was nowhere near as sophisticated as it would become. The Natalie Morrell case was flagged as a priority, a mysterious disappearance from a high-security environment. No clear suspect, a family still actively seeking answers. It had all the elements that make cold case investigators believe a breakthrough might be possible. Detective Constable Amira Hassan was assigned to lead the reinvestigation. She was 34 years old, with a background in digital forensics and a reputation for being meticulous, creative, and unwilling to accept defeat. When she opened the Morrell case file in January of 2023, Amira Hassan had no idea she was about to crack one of Toronto's most baffling mysteries. But she brought something the original investigation lacked: 16 years of technological advancement, including video enhancement capabilities, database cross-referencing tools, and forensic techniques that simply didn't exist in 2007. The cold case was about to get very hot. Detective Constable Amira Hassan started where all cold case investigators start, by reading every single page of the original file. All the witness statements, all the CCTV analysis reports, all the dead-end leads and exhausted theories. She needed to know not just what investigators had found, but what they'd been looking for and what assumptions had guided their search. One detail jumped out at her immediately: the surveillance gap. That 70-meter stretch of corridor where cameras didn't fully cover the space. That blind spot where Natalie Morrell had effectively vanished. The original investigation had treated this as a technological limitation. Cameras only covered so much area, and blind spots were inevitable in a facility as large as Toronto Pearson. But Amira approached it from a different angle. She didn't just want to know what the cameras hadn't seen. She wanted to know what they had seen that might have been overlooked. In February of 2023, Amira obtained all the original CCTV footage from November 15, 2007. We're talking about hundreds of hours of video from dozens of cameras throughout Terminal 1, archived on old digital tapes that had to be carefully extracted and converted to modern formats. She began running the footage through advanced enhancement software that didn't exist in 2007. These tools use artificial intelligence to sharpen images, improve lighting, reduce noise, and extrapolate details from low-resolution footage. The result was remarkable. Faces that had been indistinct blurs in the original investigation now resolved into recognizable features. Timestamps that had been difficult to read became clear. Background elements that had been ignored because they were too grainy to analyze suddenly came into focus. Amira focused on the window of time between 6:39 p.m., when Natalie cleared the security checkpoint, and 7:01 p.m., when boarding began for her flight. 22 minutes of Natalie's life, captured in fragments across multiple cameras. She tracked Natalie's route through the concourse, watching her walk past shops and restaurants. And then Amira did something that sounds simple but requires tremendous patience. She watched everyone else too. She created a database of every person who appeared in the same camera frames as Natalie during that 22-minute window. Travelers, airport staff, cleaning crews, retail workers. Anyone whose path intersected with or paralleled Natalie's route. There were hundreds of people in the concourse that evening. Most were random travelers, impossible to identify after 16 years. But airport employees were different. They wore uniforms, badges, and most importantly, they could be cross-referenced against employment records. Amira reached out to Toronto Pearson's Human Resources Department and requested employee rosters from November 2007. She wanted names, schedules, badge photos, and if available, badge swipe access logs. This is where things got interesting. Access logs. These were security records that tracked when employees used their ID badges to open restricted doors, access service corridors, or enter secured areas. In 2007, Toronto Pearson's access control system was relatively basic. It logged badge number, door location, and timestamp. The data was stored for auditing purposes but wasn't routinely analyzed unless there was a specific security incident. The original investigation in 2007 had reviewed some access log data, looking for any unusual activity during the time Natalie disappeared. They'd found nothing that raised red flags, just dozens of employees accessing various doors as part of their normal duties. But Amira approached the access logs differently. She didn't just look at the 18-minute window when Natalie vanished. She looked at the entire evening, tracking movement patterns of employees whose paths might have intersected with Natalie's. And she used modern database tools to cross-reference those 2007 employee names against updated criminal history databases, driving records, employment histories, and even social media profiles. One name started appearing in patterns that didn't quite make sense. Malcolm Trevor Gaines, age 43 in 2007. He worked as a ground services contractor for a company called Aero Support Services, which handled baggage, aircraft cleaning, and equipment maintenance for multiple airlines operating out of Terminal 1. Gaines had been employed at the airport for 11 years at the time of Natalie's disappearance. His record was unremarkable. No disciplinary issues, no complaints, no red flags. He'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, along with dozens of other airport employees, and nothing had stood out about him. But when Amira ran his name through updated databases in 2023, something interesting appeared. In 2016, Malcolm Gaines had been investigated, though not charged, in connection with the disappearance of a woman in Mississauga, a city just west of Toronto. The woman had eventually been found safe, having left voluntarily due to domestic issues, but during the investigation, police had noted some concerning behavior from Gaines, who'd been questioned as a potential witness. The notes in the file described him as evasive and overly interested in investigation details. In 2019, Gaines had been fired from a warehouse job after allegations of inappropriate behavior toward female coworkers. No charges were filed, but the company's internal investigation found credible evidence of harassment. These weren't smoking guns. Plenty of people have problematic behaviors that don't rise to the level of serious criminal activity. But it was enough to put Gaines on Amira's radar. She went back to the access logs from November 15, 2007, and focused specifically on Malcolm Gaines's badge swipes. At 6:17 p.m., Gaines's badge accessed a service door in Terminal 1's secure area, near the main concourse. According to his work schedule, he'd been assigned to an aircraft cleaning shift that didn't start until 7:30 p.m. So what was he doing in the terminal an hour early? At 6:46 p.m., Gaines's badge accessed another service door, this one leading to a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the concourse where Natalie was last seen. At 7:12 p.m., his badge accessed a door leading to the ground-level vehicle service area, where equipment vehicles and support trucks were parked. Amira mapped these locations and timestamps against Natalie's known movements. The first badge swipe, 6:17 p.m., occurred minutes before Natalie cleared security. The second swipe, 6:46 p.m., occurred just 3 minutes after Natalie was last seen on camera near the Tim Hortons. The third swipe at 7:12 p.m. was 26 minutes before Natalie's flight was scheduled to depart, a time when Natalie should have been at her gate but instead had vanished. Amira felt the cold case investigators' equivalent of an adrenaline rush. This was the first pattern in 16 years that connected a specific person to the right place at the right time in a way that didn't have an obvious innocent explanation. She dug deeper into Malcolm Gaines's background. Where was he now? The answer: still in the Toronto area, working for a different company doing warehouse logistics. He'd moved addresses several times since 2007 but never left the region. Amira pulled his vehicle registrations from 2007. At the time, Gaines had owned a white Ford cargo van, which he used for his job and personal use. The van had been registered to him from 2003 until 2009, when he'd sold it. Amira tracked down the vehicle's history. It had changed hands twice since Gaines sold it. The current owner had it registered in Brampton, a city northwest of Toronto. This is where Amira faced a critical decision. She had a person of interest whose movements aligned suspiciously with Natalie's disappearance, but she had no physical evidence, no witness placing him with Natalie, and no confession. She needed more before approaching Gaines directly, because once he knew he was under suspicion, any opportunity to gather evidence quietly would evaporate. She needed a search warrant, but to get one, she needed probable cause. The badge swipe pattern was suggestive but not definitive. She needed to build a stronger case. Amira went back to the enhanced CCTV footage, this time looking specifically for Malcolm Gaines. She pulled his employee badge photo from 2007 and used facial recognition software to scan through hours of airport footage from November 15th. And there he was. At 6:44 p.m., 1 minute after Natalie was last seen on camera, Malcolm Gaines appeared in the background of a camera frame near a service corridor entrance. He was wearing his Aero Support uniform. He was looking toward the main concourse. And in the enhanced footage, you could see something that the grainy 2007 video had rendered invisible. He was holding open a service door marked, "Authorized personnel only." The camera angle didn't show if anyone entered that door. But the timing was impossible to ignore. 60 seconds after Natalie Morrell walked out of camera view, Malcolm Gaines was standing at a service door in the blind spot where she'd vanished, holding that door open. Amira took her findings to her supervising officer. Together they reviewed the evidence. The badge swipe timeline, the enhanced footage showing Gaines at the service door, his subsequent problematic behavior history, and the vehicle he'd owned in 2007. In March of 2023, they applied for and received a search warrant. The targets: Malcolm Gaines's current residence, his workplace, and, most ambitiously, any storage units, garages, or properties he'd had access to since 2007. They also obtained a warrant to locate and search the white Ford cargo van Gaines had owned in 2007, even though it was now owned by someone else and had changed hands multiple times. On March 22, 2023, a coordinated search began. Multiple teams executed the warrants simultaneously. This was the moment when a cold case 16 years old could either break wide open or collapse into another dead end. What they found would shock everyone involved in the investigation. The search of Malcolm Gaines's current residence in Etobicoke yielded typical household items, personal effects, nothing immediately incriminating. But investigators weren't expecting the smoking gun to be sitting in plain sight in his living room. The real target was deeper: storage areas, hidden spaces, evidence he might have kept as trophies or simply forgotten about. Forensic teams swabbed surfaces, collected fibers, searched through closets and drawers. They imaged his computer hard drives and seized his phones. This was painstaking work, every item logged, every surface documented. At Gaines's workplace, investigators interviewed his co-workers and supervisors. The picture that emerged was of a man who kept to himself, did his job competently but without enthusiasm, and had few close relationships. Several co-workers described him as a bit odd, someone who made uncomfortable eye contact or whose conversations felt slightly off-key. But nobody reported anything overtly threatening. The real breakthrough came from two sources that required creative investigative work. First, the storage unit. Detectives combing through Gaines's financial records discovered he'd maintained a rental storage unit in Mississauga continuously since 2006. He'd been paying the monthly fees for 17 years, an expense that seemed unusual for someone with relatively modest income and no obvious need for extra storage space. The storage facility's records showed the unit was a standard 10 by 10 space, one of hundreds in a sprawling complex. Gaines had never been late on payments, never drawn attention to himself. Investigators obtained a warrant for the storage unit and arrived with forensic teams in tow. What they found inside was a carefully organized space that felt deeply wrong. Boxes labeled with years and locations, filing systems that documented movements and routines, and buried in the back, in a sealed plastic container that had been hidden under old furniture, they found items that didn't belong to Malcolm Gaines. A woman's leather laptop bag. Inside it, a laptop computer that had long since stopped functioning, a tablet, and several business documents bearing the name Natalie Morrell. There were makeup items, a travel-sized perfume bottle, and personal effects that matched the inventory of items Natalie's family had reported she would have been carrying the night she disappeared. The laptop bag alone would have been significant, but there was more. Beneath the laptop bag, wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting, investigators found a small black rolling suitcase, the kind of carry-on bag a business traveler might use for a short overnight trip. Inside the suitcase were clothes, professional attire, toiletries, a pair of ankle boots. Everything was preserved in an almost pristine state, as if someone had carefully stored these items to prevent deterioration. Tags on the clothing matched brands Natalie's family confirmed she wore. One sweater still had a dry cleaning tag with a Toronto business address and a date from October 2007. This was Natalie's luggage. These were her belongings. The items that had vanished with her from Toronto Pearson Airport on November 15, 2007, had been hidden in Malcolm Gaines's storage unit for 16 years. But the most damning evidence was biological. Forensic teams found trace evidence, microscopic biological materials, on some of the items in the storage unit. Blood spatter that had been cleaned but not thoroughly enough to remove all traces. Hair samples, biological fluids that modern DNA analysis could test. When those samples were processed through the forensic lab, the DNA profile matched Natalie Elise Morrell. Her profile was on file from the original investigation, collected from her apartment and personal effects in 2007. The DNA evidence placed Natalie's biological materials in Malcolm Gaines's storage unit, mixed with materials that could only have come from a violent encounter. The second major breakthrough came from the white Ford cargo van. This vehicle had been sold twice since Gaines owned it. The current owner was a contractor in Brampton who'd bought it in 2014 and had used it hard work equipment, tools, construction materials. The van had over 300,000 kilometers on it and was showing its age. But forensic teams know that certain types of evidence can persist even through years of use and multiple owners. Biological materials can seep into fabrics, crevices, and spaces where cleaning doesn't reach. Investigators brought the van to a forensic garage and performed a comprehensive examination. They removed panels, pulled up floor mats, examined the cargo area with specialized lighting that reveals biological materials invisible to the naked eye. In the seams of the cargo area's floor panels, beneath the current rubber mats and layers of accumulated dirt, forensic technicians found trace blood evidence. It had soaked into the metal and sealant layers, protected from casual cleaning by subsequent owners who never knew it was there. DNA analysis of those traces matched Natalie Elise Morrell. There was something else too. Hair samples, several long dark hairs, were found embedded in the van's interior panel seams. The hairs matched Natalie's DNA profile and showed characteristics consistent with having been forcibly removed, with root material still attached. Investigators now had a timeline they could reconstruct with evidence, not just theory. On November 15, 2007, Malcolm Gaines arrived at Toronto Pearson Airport before his scheduled shift, entering the secure area using his employee badge. He positioned himself near a service corridor in a surveillance blind spot. When Natalie Morrell walked through that area, he intercepted her, likely posing as airport security or an official who needed to discuss some issue with her travel plans. He directed her through the service door, the one captured on enhanced footage with him holding it open, into areas of the airport where cameras didn't monitor. Using his intimate knowledge of the terminal's layout and blind spots, he moved her through maintenance corridors to the ground level, where his white Ford van was parked in the service vehicle area. The access log swipe at 7:12 p.m., accessing the door to the vehicle area, marked the moment when Gaines transported Natalie out of the airport. Where he took her after that and what happened in the hours or days that followed, investigators could only partially reconstruct from forensic evidence. But the blood evidence, the hair samples showing signs of trauma, and the complete absence of Natalie from that point forward told a grim story. Malcolm Gaines had murdered Natalie Elise Morrell. He'd kept her belongings as trophies, stored carefully in a unit he visited periodically. The psychological profile suggested this was important to him, maintaining control over physical objects connected to his victim, revisiting them, perhaps reliving the crime. Investigators conducted extensive searches of areas where Gaines had lived, worked, or frequented since 2007, looking for burial sites or locations where he might have disposed of remains. They used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and analyzed satellite imagery looking for ground disturbances in rural areas he'd been known to visit. As of the arrest in 2024, Natalie's remains had not been recovered. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had connected Gaines to the crime through physical evidence, timeline analysis, and the preservation of Natalie's belongings. In May of 2024, Detective Constable Amira Hassan and her team had built a case strong enough to present to prosecutors. The Crown Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence and agreed. They had enough to charge Malcolm Trevor Gaines with kidnapping and first-degree murder in the death of Natalie Elise Morrell. On May 13, 2024, 16 years, 5 months, and 28 days after Natalie vanished, Toronto police moved to arrest the man who'd taken her life. The arrest happens at dawn. This is deliberate. You want to catch a suspect when they're disoriented, when their defenses are down, when the sudden presence of police creates maximum psychological impact. Malcolm Gaines lives in a small rented house in Etobicoke, a working-class neighborhood about 20 minutes from Toronto Pearson Airport. He's 59 years old now, nearly 60. He works third shift at a warehouse, usually sleeping until mid-afternoon. At 6:17 a.m. on May 13, 2024, tactical officers surround the house. Detective Constable Amira Hassan is there, along with her partner and 4 uniformed officers. They have an arrest warrant, signed by a judge, charging Malcolm Trevor Gaines with kidnapping, first-degree murder, and indignity to human remains in connection with the death of Natalie Elise Morrell. They knock. Loud, authoritative. Toronto police. We have a warrant. There's a delay. Movement inside the house. A light turns on. 30 seconds pass, then a minute. Officers are positioned at the back door in case Gaines tries to run, but there's nowhere for him to go. The front door opens. Malcolm Gaines stands there in pajama pants and a t-shirt, squinting against the early morning light, looking confused and half asleep. Malcolm Trevor Gaines? Amira's voice is calm, professional, carrying the authority of someone who's been working toward this moment for over a year. Yeah, that's me. What's this about? You're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Natalie Elise Morrell. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. There's always a moment, where a suspect's reaction tells you everything. Some people collapse. Some people run. Some people fight. Some people cry or protest their innocence immediately. Malcolm Gaines does none of these things. His expression shifts through a series of microchanges. Confusion, then recognition of the name, then something that looks like resignation. He doesn't ask who. He doesn't say, I don't know what you're talking about. He turns around slowly and puts his hands behind his back. You have the right to remain silent, Amira begins, reciting the Canadian Charter rights as handcuffs click into place. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay. Gaines is silent. He's led to a police cruiser, placed in the back seat. Forensic teams immediately begin processing his house, looking for additional evidence, anything that might fill in the remaining gaps in the case. The charges laid against Malcolm Gaines are severe. First-degree murder, which in Canadian law means the killing was planned and deliberate. Prosecutors believe Gaines had identified Natalie as a target, possibly watching her on previous trips through the airport, possibly selecting her at random that evening, and used his position and knowledge of the airport to create an opportunity. Kidnapping, which applies because Gaines unlawfully confined Natalie and transported her from the airport. Indignity to human remains, which covers his disposal of Natalie's body in a manner that showed disrespect to the deceased. Even without recovering the remains, the evidence of his actions supports this charge. Additional charges include obstruction of justice and breach of trust, related to his use of his airport security access and his concealment of evidence. If convicted on all counts, Malcolm Gaines faces a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The news breaks later that morning. Toronto police hold a press conference at noon. Deputy Chief Laura Morrison stands at a podium, flanked by Detective Constable Amira Hassan and representatives from the Cold Case Unit. This morning, Toronto police arrested a 59-year-old man in connection with the 2007 disappearance and murder of Natalie Elise Morrell. Deputy Chief Morrison begins. This arrest is the result of tireless work by our cold case investigators, who utilized modern forensic technology to solve a case that has remained unsolved for more than 16 years. The room is packed with reporters. Camera flashes pop continuously. This is major news. The resolution of a case that has haunted Toronto for nearly 2 decades. We believe the accused used his position as an airport employee to gain access to Ms. Morrell and to remove her from the secured area of Toronto Pearson Airport. Morrison continues. Forensic evidence recovered during the investigation conclusively links the accused to Ms. Morrell's belongings and establishes that a violent crime occurred. In the back of the press conference room, Susan and Robert Morrell sit with their daughter Jennifer. They'd been notified of the arrest early that morning, given a few hours to process the information before it became public. The emotions are complex. There's relief that someone has finally been held accountable. There's grief at the confirmation, no longer a possibility but a certainty, that Natalie is gone. There's gratitude toward the investigators who never gave up. And there's anger, deep and justified, at the man who stole their daughter and sister, who let them suffer in uncertainty for 16 years, while he lived his life knowing exactly what he'd done. Susan will later tell reporters, "We always knew Natalie wouldn't have left us voluntarily. We always believed something terrible happened to her that night. Having that belief confirmed is heartbreaking, but at least now we know. At least now there can be justice." The reaction across Toronto is one of shock mixed with vindication. The case of the woman who vanished from the airport has been part of the city's collective consciousness for years. True crime enthusiasts have debated theories in online forums. Local news has featured anniversary stories every November 15th. Natalie's face has looked out from missing person posters in coffee shops and community centers throughout the city. And now, suddenly, there's an answer. There's a face and a name attached to the crime. Malcolm Gaines, an ordinary-looking man who worked at the airport, who had access and opportunity, who managed to commit a brazen abduction in one of the most surveilled environments imaginable. Social media explodes with reactions. Some people express anger that it took 16 years to solve. Others praise the cold case investigators for their persistence. Many focus on the horror of the crime itself, how vulnerable we all are in spaces we assume are safe, how predators can hide in positions of authority and trust. Airport security becomes a focal point of discussion. How could someone with Gaines's access and knowledge exploit the system so effectively? What gaps still exist? Toronto Pearson immediately announces a comprehensive review of security protocols, particularly regarding employee access to secure areas and surveillance coverage. Other families of missing persons see the Morrell case as a beacon of hope. If a 16-year-old cold case can be solved, maybe their cases can be too. Advocacy groups push for more resources for cold case units, for preservation of evidence, for continued advancement of forensic technology. Malcolm Gaines makes his first court appearance 2 days after his arrest, appearing via video link from detention. He's represented by a public defender at this initial bail hearing. The Crown argues strenuously against bail, citing the severity of the charges, the strength of the evidence, and the 16 years Gaines evaded justice. The judge agrees. Bail is denied. Gaines will remain in custody pending trial. He enters a plea of not guilty to all charges. This is standard. Most defendants plead not guilty initially, even when the evidence against them is overwhelming. It preserves their right to trial and forces the prosecution to present its full case. A trial date is set for February of 2025, giving both sides time to prepare for what will be a complex, evidence-heavy proceeding. The cold case that gripped Toronto for 16 years is about to become one of the most closely watched trials in recent Canadian history. The trial of Malcolm Trevor Gaines begins on February 3, 2025, in a Toronto courtroom that's been specially equipped to handle the volume of media attention and the technical requirements of presenting complex forensic evidence. Justice Patricia Thornton presides. She's a veteran of the Ontario Superior Court, known for running an efficient courtroom while ensuring both sides have full opportunity to present their cases. The Crown's case is led by Senior Assistant Crown Attorney David Brennan, a prosecutor with 2 decades of experience in major crimes. The defense is handled by Miranda Chan, a skilled criminal defense attorney who's taken on Gaines's case knowing that public opinion is heavily against her client but determined to ensure he receives a fair trial. The jury selection takes 3 days. The pool of potential jurors is large, but many are dismissed for cause. They followed the case too closely in the media. They've formed opinions. They have connections to the Morrell family or to airport security. Eventually, 12 jurors and 2 alternates are seated. 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to early 60s. Crown Attorney Brennan's opening statement lays out a straightforward narrative. Malcolm Gaines used his position, knowledge, and access to abduct Natalie Morrell from Toronto Pearson Airport on November 15, 2007. He transported her from the airport in his van, murdered her, disposed of her remains, and kept her belongings hidden for 16 years until modern investigative techniques finally exposed his crime. The evidence you will hear is both circumstantial and forensic. Brennan tells the jury. It includes enhanced video footage, access control logs, DNA analysis, and testimony from experts who will explain how 2023 technology solved a 2007 cold case. By the end of this trial, you will be convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that Malcolm Gaines is responsible for the kidnapping and death of Natalie Elise Morrell. Defense attorney Chen's opening is more cautious. She doesn't deny that Gaines's belongings were found in the storage unit, but she questions the chain of evidence, suggests alternative explanations, and emphasizes that without Natalie's remains, without witnesses to the actual crime, the prosecution's case relies heavily on interpretation and inference. The Crown will present compelling forensic evidence, Chen acknowledges, but I ask you to consider carefully whether that evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt that my client committed murder, or whether it shows he had contact with Ms. Morrell's belongings through some other means we don't yet fully understand. It's a difficult position. The evidence is strong, but Chen's job is to create reasonable doubt, and she's skilled at her work. The prosecution calls its first witnesses, Natalie's family and friends, who establish who she was, what her life was like, why she would never have voluntarily disappeared. Susan Morrell takes the stand, her voice steady despite the tears that stream down her face as she describes her daughter. Natalie called me every single day, every day for 28 years. She would never, ever, have chosen to leave without saying goodbye, without explanation. Whatever happened to her that night was not her choice. Jennifer testifies about the last conversation she had with her sister, about the years of searching, about the hope that slowly transformed into the painful acceptance that Natalie was likely gone, but the need for answers never diminished. Friends and coworkers paint a picture of a woman who was responsible, reliable, excited about her career, connected to her community. Not someone who would abandon her job, her family, her entire life on a whim. Detective Sergeant Marcus Shaw, who led the original 2007 investigation, testifies about the exhaustive initial search, the review of CCTV footage with the technology available at the time, the dead ends and frustrations. He's retired now but came back specifically to testify in this case. We knew something had happened to Ms. Morrell, Shaw tells the jury. But with the surveillance gaps and the limited investigative tools available in 2007, we couldn't determine what. The case haunted me throughout my career. Then Detective Constable Amira Hassan takes the stand. She walks the jury through her reinvestigation, explaining in clear terms how modern video enhancement technology allowed her to see details that were invisible in 2007. The Crown presents the enhanced footage. On large monitors set up in the courtroom, jurors watch the video of Natalie walking through the concourse. They see the timestamp, 6:43 p.m. They watch her walk out of frame. Then they see the next piece of footage, enhanced to reveal Malcolm Gaines standing at a service corridor door at 6:44 p.m., holding it open. This is the moment we believe Ms. Morrell was directed into the service corridor, Amira testifies. The accused was in position with access at the exact time and place where Ms. Morrell disappeared from camera coverage. The defense cross-examines vigorously. Chun questions whether the enhanced footage actually shows Gaines holding the door open or simply standing near it. She questions whether someone else could have accessed that door. She emphasizes that the footage doesn't show Natalie entering the corridor. But the cumulative effect of the timeline is damning. The access logs, the video, the 18-minute window, it all points to Gaines being in the right place at the right time with the means and opportunity to intercept Natalie. The heart of the Crown's case is the forensic testimony. This is where the trial becomes highly technical, with experts explaining DNA analysis, blood spatter interpretation, and trace evidence recovery. Dr. Rachel Kim, a forensic biologist with the Center of Forensic Sciences, testifies about the items found in Gaines's storage unit. She describes the recovery of the laptop bag and suitcase, the biological materials found on and within them, and the DNA analysis that matched Natalie Morrell's profile. The DNA evidence places Ms. Morrell's biological materials, including blood, in direct contact with items stored in the accused storage unit. Dr. Kim explains, the blood spatter patterns are consistent with high-velocity impact, suggesting traumatic injury. Another expert testifies about the trace evidence found in the Ford cargo van. despite the vehicle changing hands twice and accumulating 16 years of use, and where microscopic blood traces matching Natalie's DNA profile were recovered from floor seam areas. Biological materials can persist in vehicles far longer than most people realize. The expert explains. Blood soaks into porous surfaces, into seams and crevices where casual cleaning doesn't reach. Even comprehensive cleaning often misses trace amounts. The trial also includes victim impact elements woven throughout. Natalie's coworkers testify about her professionalism, her kindness, the hole her disappearance left in their workplace. Her volunteer coordinator from the Literacy Center describes how Natalie's students were devastated when she vanished, how several asked for years whether she'd come back. These testimonies serve a dual purpose. They humanize Natalie beyond just being a victim, and they establish the profound impact of her loss. The defense calls its own experts who question some of the forensic interpretations. One defense witness suggests the DNA in the storage unit could have been transferred through secondary contact. Perhaps Gaines found Natalie's bags abandoned somewhere and took them, not knowing they were connected to a missing person. It's a thin argument, and the prosecution shreds it on cross-examination. Why would someone take abandoned luggage and carefully store it for 16 years? Why would Natalie's blood be in a van Gaines owned? Why were his badge swipes aligned so precisely with her disappearance? The defense also emphasizes the lack of remains. Without a body, without a clear cause of death, can the Crown really prove murder beyond reasonable doubt? Couldn't Natalie have survived the encounter and died later of natural causes? Couldn't there be explanations the investigation hasn't uncovered? Malcolm Gaines does not testify in his own defense. This is his constitutional right, and the jury is instructed not to draw negative inferences from his silence. But practically, it means the defense has no alternative narrative to offer, no explanation from Gaines himself about why Natalie's belongings were in his storage unit, why her DNA was in his van, why his movements aligned so precisely with her disappearance. Closing arguments span 2 full days. Crown Attorney Brennan methodically walks the jury through every piece of evidence, building a comprehensive picture of guilt. He emphasizes the forensic evidence, the timeline, the lack of any innocent explanation for the totality of the facts. Malcolm Gaines used his position of trust, his access to secure areas, and his knowledge of surveillance gaps to abduct Natalie Morrell, Brennan concludes. He murdered her, disposed of her remains, and kept trophies of his crime hidden for 16 years. The evidence is overwhelming. Justice demands a verdict of guilty. Defense Attorney Chun makes her final appeal for reasonable doubt. She emphasizes the lack of witnesses, the absence of remains, the circumstantial nature of some evidence. She questions whether the Crown has truly proven murder or simply proven that Gaines had contact with Natalie's belongings. My client deserves the same presumption of innocence, the same requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, as anyone. Chun tells the jury, if you have doubts, if the Crown has not met its burden, you must acquit. Justice Thornton charges the jury with detailed instructions about the law of murder, the standards of proof, the elements of each charge. She emphasizes that emotion cannot drive their verdict, only evidence. On February 26, 2025, the jury retires to deliberate. The Morrell family waits. Detective Constable Amira Hassan waits. The city of Toronto, watching through media coverage, waits. For 4 days, the jury deliberates. This isn't unusual for a complex case, but each passing day increases the tension. Are they struggling with reasonable doubt? Is there disagreement among the jurors? On March 2nd, word comes. The jury has reached a verdict. The courtroom is packed. Every seat in the public gallery is filled. Media representatives occupy their designated section. Susan, Robert, and Jennifer Morrell sit in the front row, holding hands, their faces showing the exhaustion of nearly 2 decades of searching and 6 weeks of trial. Malcolm Gaines is led into the courtroom by security officers. He sits at the defense table, his expression unreadable. He's 59 years old, his hair graying, his face lined. He looks like someone's uncle, someone's neighbor. Utterly ordinary. Justice Thornton enters. Everyone rises, then sits. The formalities are brief. Has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreperson, a middle-aged man who's shown thoughtful attention throughout the trial, stands. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Elise Morrell. How do you find the defendant?" The courtroom is absolutely silent. Every person is holding their breath. "Guilty." The reaction is immediate. Susan Morrell gasps and breaks into sobs. Robert puts his arms around her. Jennifer covers her face with her hands. Behind them, members of the public who followed the case begin to cry. There's a palpable sense of release, of justice finally arriving after an impossibly long wait. Malcolm Gaines shows no reaction. He stares straight ahead, his face blank. The foreperson continues. "On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of indignity to human remains, guilty. On obstruction of justice, guilty. Guilty on all counts." Justice Thornton thanks the jury for their service and dismisses them. She sets a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, giving the Crown time to prepare victim impact statements and the defense time to submit any relevant sentencing materials. Outside the courthouse, the Morrell family faces a wall of media. Susan reads a prepared statement, her voice shaking but determined. "Today, justice was served for our daughter Natalie. While nothing can bring her back, knowing that the person responsible will be held accountable provides some measure of peace. We are grateful to Detective Hassan and the entire cold case team who never gave up on Natalie. We are grateful to the prosecutors who presented our daughter's case with such care and respect. And we are grateful to the jury for their careful attention to the evidence." She pauses, gathering strength. Natalie was a beautiful, kind, ambitious young woman who had her entire life stolen from her at 28 years old. We have lived for 16 years not knowing what happened to her, not knowing if she suffered, not knowing where she is. We still don't have her remains. We still can't lay her to rest properly. But at least now we know the truth. At least now justice has been served. Jennifer adds, "If anyone watching this has information about where our sister might be, please come forward. We need to bring Natalie home." The sentencing hearing takes place on March 15th, 2025. This is where the Morrell family has the opportunity to directly address the impact of Natalie's murder. Susan speaks first. She talks about the phone call that never came on November 16th, 2007. The growing panic, the years of searching, the birthdays, holidays, and milestones celebrated with Natalie's absence like a wound that never heals. Every day for 16 years, I wondered if my daughter suffered. I wondered if she called out for help. I wondered if she thought of us in her last moments. Malcolm Gaines knows the answers to those questions, and he has remained silent, even now. That cruelty is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Robert speaks about his daughter's dreams, the career she was building, the life she deserved to live. Natalie should be here. She should be 45 years old. She might have been married, might have had children of her own, might have achieved extraordinary things in her career. All of that was stolen by the man sitting in this courtroom. Jennifer's statement is raw and powerful. She talks about growing up with Natalie as her role model, about the sisterhood they shared, about the guilt she still carries for not somehow preventing what happened. "I want Malcolm Gaines to know that he didn't just take my sister. He took a piece of every person who loved her. He took our sense of safety. He took our ability to trust that airports and security systems would keep people safe. He took 16 years of our lives that we spent searching desperately for answers. And he did all of this while living his life, going to work, sleeping soundly, never once showing remorse or compassion for what he'd done." Crown Attorney Brennan argues for the maximum sentence. In Canadian law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Brennan asks that the court consider the exceptional cruelty of the case, the exploitation of trust, the vulnerability of the victim, the 16 years of silence, as factors that should deny Gaines any consideration for early parole beyond the mandatory minimum. The defense offers no mitigation. There's nothing to say. Gaines has no history of mental illness that would explain his actions. He has no remorse to demonstrate. He offers no information about where Natalie's remains might be. Justice Thornton delivers the sentence with measured gravity. Malcolm Trevor Gaines, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of the first-degree murder of Natalie Elise Morrell, along with related charges. The evidence presented at trial established that you used your position of trust and access to abduct Ms. Morrell from Toronto Pearson Airport in November of 2007. You murdered her, disposed of her remains in a location that has not been disclosed, and kept her belongings as trophies while her family suffered for 16 years not knowing her fate. This was a calculated, cruel crime. You exploited vulnerabilities in airport security. You used your knowledge to evade detection for nearly 2 decades. And you have shown no remorse, no willingness to provide the Morrell family with the basic dignity of knowing where their daughter's remains are so they can lay her to rest. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years on the charge of first-degree murder. This sentence will run concurrently with sentences on the remaining charges. Given the nature of this crime and your complete lack of cooperation, I am recommending to the parole board that you not be granted early consideration for parole beyond the statutory minimum. Malcolm Gaines is led from the courtroom. He will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. If he lives to see parole eligibility at age 84, it will be up to a parole board to determine if he's ever released. Outside the courthouse, there's a sense of completion, though not of closure. Closure is a concept that doesn't quite fit the reality of losing someone to murder. But there is resolution. There is accountability. There is a verdict that says Natalie's life mattered, that what was done to her was wrong, that society demands justice even when it takes 16 years to arrive. Detective Constable Amira Hassan stands with the Morrell family for a final press conference. She's asked what solving this cold case means to her. Natalie Morrell deserved justice. Her family deserved answers. I'm honored to have been part of the team that finally provided both. This case shows that we never give up on victims, no matter how much time has passed. Cold cases can be solved. Advances in technology give us tools that didn't exist a decade ago. And as long as there are unanswered questions, there will be investigators working to answer them. The conviction of Malcolm Gaines in the murder of Natalie Elise Morrell reverberates far beyond one courtroom, one family, one solved case. For the Morrell family, the verdict brings a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. Knowing what happened doesn't bring Natalie back. It doesn't fill the hole left by 16 years of her absence. But it transforms uncertainty into knowledge, and knowledge, however painful, is something you can begin to process. Susan and Robert established the Natalie Morrell Memorial Fund, which provides support for families of missing persons and funds scholarships for young women pursuing careers in marketing and communications. It's a way to honor their daughter's memory by helping others. Jennifer continues her advocacy work, now with a different focus. She works with cold case units across Canada, helping to raise awareness about unsolved missing persons cases and advocating for resources to apply modern technology to older investigations. The family continues to search for Natalie's remains. Malcolm Gaines has provided no information about where he disposed of her body, and without his cooperation, finding her may prove impossible. But they haven't given up hope. Periodically, they work with investigators to search properties Gaines had access to, following up on tips using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies. We want to bring Natalie home, Susan tells reporters on the 1-year anniversary of Gaines's conviction. We want to have a place to visit her, to properly say goodbye. That's the final piece we're still missing. The case prompts significant changes at Toronto Pearson International Airport and airports across Canada. The ability of an employee to exploit surveillance gaps and access control systems to commit such a brazen crime exposed vulnerabilities that administrators had either overlooked or underestimated. A comprehensive security audit is conducted, resulting in several key changes. Surveillance coverage is dramatically expanded, with particular attention to eliminating blind spots in secure areas. Modern high-definition cameras with AI-enhanced monitoring are installed throughout all terminals. Employee access protocols are tightened. Badge swipe logs are now monitored in real time using algorithms that flag unusual patterns. Employees accessing areas outside their normal duties, movements that don't align with work schedules, repeated access to locations without clear job-related justification. A 2-person rule is implemented for certain secure areas, requiring that employees in sensitive locations work in pairs or have their activities subject to additional oversight. Training for airport security personnel is enhanced, focusing on recognizing predatory behavior, understanding how trusted insiders can exploit systems, and maintaining awareness of employees who may pose threats. These changes are expensive and require ongoing resources, but the Natalie Morrell case made clear that the cost of inadequate security is far higher. The case becomes a touchstone for cold case investigations across North America. It's studied in forensic science courses, presented at law enforcement conferences, and referenced in training materials for investigators. The key lessons are clear. Preserve everything. Evidence that seems useless with current technology may be invaluable a decade later. The access logs from 2007, which led nowhere at the time, became crucial when cross-referenced with modern databases. Never close cases prematurely. The pressure to move on from unsolved investigations is constant. But the Morrell case proves that patience and persistence can eventually yield results. Embrace new technology. Video enhancement, DNA analysis, database cross-referencing, these tools evolve rapidly. Old cases should be periodically reviewed using the latest available technology. Context matters. Detective Hassan's decision to look not just at what cameras showed during the 18-minute window, but at the entire evening's footage and the patterns of employee movement, exemplifies how broadening investigative scope can reveal connections others miss. The solved case provides hope for other families living with the uncertainty of a missing loved one. In the months following Gaines's conviction, several other cold cases from the 2000s are reopened and assigned to specialized teams using similar methodologies. At least 3 cases in Canada benefit directly from techniques developed during the Morrell investigation. One case from 2009 is solved when enhanced footage reveals a license plate that was previously unreadable. Another case from 2012 breaks open when investigators apply the access log analysis approach to a different secure facility. The message to families is powerful. Don't give up. Cases that seem impossible can be solved. Technology is advancing. Investigators are learning. Justice, though delayed, can still arrive. For Detective Constable Amira Hassan, solving the Morrell case becomes the defining achievement of her career. She's promoted to detective sergeant and becomes a specialist in cold case investigations using advanced technology. She trains other investigators across Canada and internationally in the techniques that cracked the case. But she's quick to point out that the resolution wasn't about individual brilliance. This case was solved because we had the resources to apply modern technology, because the evidence was preserved, because the Morrell family never stopped advocating, and because a team of investigators worked together. It's not about one person. It's about the system working the way it's supposed to work, pursuing justice no matter how long it takes. Detective Sergeant Marcus Shaw, who led the original investigation, finds a measure of peace in the resolution. He'd retired in 2019 carrying the weight of several unsolved cases, including Natalie's. When Hassan contacted him in 2023 to say she was reopening the case, he'd provided everything he could: files, memories, insights from the original investigation. I always believed this case would be solved eventually, Shaw reflects. I just hoped I'd still be around to see it. Justice for Natalie feels like justice for all the cases we couldn't solve during my career. It reminds us why we do this work. The story of Natalie Elise Morrell is ultimately about persistence. Persistence of family love, persistence of investigative determination, and persistence of the belief that truth eventually emerges, even when buried under years of silence. It's about the vulnerability we all face in spaces we trust to be safe. Airports, with their security checkpoints and cameras, create an illusion of protection. But predators can wear uniforms. They can carry badges. They can know exactly where the blind spots are. It's about the unintended consequences of surveillance gaps. The 70 meters of corridor where cameras didn't quite cover everything created an opportunity for evil. It's a reminder that security is only as strong as its weakest point. It's about the power of technology to both create and solve problems. The surveillance system of 2007 was advanced for its time but full of limitations. The technology of 2023, enhanced imaging, DNA analysis, database cross-referencing, finally provided the tools to see what had been invisible for 16 years. and it's about the impact of a single life. Natalie was 28 years old when she died. She had decades of life ahead of her. Who knows what she would have accomplished, what contributions she would have made, whose lives she would have touched. Murder doesn't just end one life. It ripples outward, affecting everyone connected to the victim, changing the trajectory of families and communities. Malcolm Gaines remains in federal prison. He has never expressed remorse. He has never provided information about where he disposed of Natalie's remains. In conversations with prison psychologists, conversations later referenced in public documents, he has been described as having narcissistic traits and showing a disturbing lack of empathy. Investigators believe Natalie was likely not his only victim. The organized way he stored her belongings, the confidence with which he exploited the airport security system, the patterns identified in his behavior, all suggest someone who may have engaged in predatory behavior before. Other unsolved disappearances from the 2000s are being reviewed for possible connections. But without his cooperation, and without additional evidence, those investigations remain open questions. Toronto remembers Natalie Elise Morrell. A small memorial was installed at Toronto Pearson Airport in 2026, a year after Gaines's conviction. It's a simple plaque near Terminal 1, bearing Natalie's name and a brief inscription. In memory of Natalie Elise Morrell, 1979 to 2007. May all who travel here do so safely. The memorial serves multiple purposes. It honors Natalie. It reminds airport staff and travelers that security is not abstract. It protects real people with real lives. And it stands as a promise that the people who work to keep travelers safe remember what happens when systems fail. Every November 15th, the anniversary of Natalie's disappearance, the Morrell family gathers at the memorial. They're usually joined by investigators who worked the case, by strangers who followed the story, by families of other missing persons who find solidarity in shared grief. They light candles. They share stories about Natalie. They take comfort in community and in the knowledge that her case was solved, that justice was served, that she's remembered. This case teaches us several crucial lessons about cold cases and missing persons investigations. Time doesn't necessarily work against justice. While fresh cases have advantages, cold cases have something unique: the ability to apply new technology to old evidence, to see patterns invisible to the original investigators, to cross-reference information against databases that didn't exist when the crime occurred. Family advocacy matters. The Morrell family's refusal to let Natalie's case fade into obscurity kept pressure on law enforcement, kept the case in public consciousness, and ensured resources would eventually be allocated to solve it. Predators who feel safe become careless. Malcolm Gaines kept Natalie's belongings for 16 years, likely visiting them periodically. This overconfidence, the belief that he'd successfully evaded detection, led to preservation of evidence that ultimately convicted him. Every missing person case deserves attention and resources. Natalie disappeared from an airport, which made her case high profile. But thousands of people vanish every year in less dramatic circumstances. Each one deserves the same investigative effort, the same application of modern technology, the same commitment to finding answers. If you take one thing from Natalie's story, let it be this: every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers. Every missing person poster represents people who love and miss someone desperately. Every unsolved case is a story of interrupted lives, unfinished dreams, and unanswered questions. And sometimes, even after 16 years, those questions can be answered. Justice can be served. Truth can emerge from darkness. The solved cold case of Natalie Elise Morrell stands as testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of technology, and the fundamental belief that every person matters enough to never give up searching for the truth about what happened to them. Natalie Elise Morrell walked into Toronto Pearson Airport on November 15, 2007, expecting to take a short flight to Montreal and return home the next day. She never imagined those would be her last hours of freedom, her final moments before encountering a predator who'd been waiting in the shadows. For 16 years, her family searched. For 16 years, investigators held onto the case file, hoping technology would eventually catch up. For 16 years, Natalie's story remained one of Toronto's most haunting mysteries. And then, in 2023, a determined cold case detective named Amira Hassan opened that file again. She looked at old evidence with new tools. She saw patterns others had missed. She built a case piece by piece, connecting digital breadcrumbs across 16 years until they led to Malcolm Gaines's door. The arrest shocked the community. The trial exposed the vulnerability we all face in spaces we assume are safe. The conviction brought justice, though it couldn't restore what was taken. Natalie's remains have not been found, but her family continues to search. They continue to hope that one day they'll bring her home for a proper burial. They continue to honor her memory through advocacy, through the Memorial Fund, through refusing to let her be forgotten. This case reminds us that behind every cold case file is a human being. Someone who was loved. Someone who had dreams. Someone whose absence leaves a permanent hole in the lives of everyone who knew them. It reminds us that perpetrators don't always look like monsters. They wear uniforms. They carry badges. They move through our communities undetected until the moment when evidence and technology and investigative persistence finally converge to expose them. It reminds us that justice, though sometimes agonizingly slow, is still worth pursuing. 25 years from now, Malcolm Gaines might be eligible for parole. He'll be 84 years old. Whether he's ever released will depend on factors we can't predict now. But at minimum, he'll have served a quarter-century in prison for what he did to Natalie Morrell. That's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. And most importantly, this case reminds us to never stop looking for answers. If you know someone who's missing, if you have information about an unsolved case, if you see something that doesn't seem right, speak up. Your tip could be the one that breaks a case wide open. Your information could be what brings someone home to their family. Cold cases get solved. Technology advances. Investigators refuse to give up. And sometimes, after years of darkness and uncertainty, light finally breaks through. For Natalie Elise Morrell, that light came 16 years too late. But it came. Justice was served. Her family has answers. And her story stands as a beacon of hope for every other family still waiting to learn what happened to someone they love. This case reminds us that every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers, a community still seeking closure. If you have any information about unsolved cases in your area, remember that your tip could be the one that brings someone home, that finally allows a family to heal. With that said, thanks for listening to the story of Natalie Elise Morrell and the 16-year journey to justice. Until next time.